Okay, let's see. So I was actually just telling these guys before that these topics are very disparate. So like the people we are on stage today, but let's try to synthesize something and get a consensus or not. But maybe we could start off with a set of introductions. AJ, maybe you can kick things off.
Sure. AJ, Chief Strategy Officer at Offchain Labs, most commonly known for developing the Arbitrum L2 stack, as well as we're also the core developers of the Prism staking software. So, hey.
Hey everyone, my name is Verity Coltman. I look after ecosystem at Espresso. I've been there for about a year, and we're building an AVS on EigenLayer. But effectively what we allow rollups to do is use our consensus as a fast finality layer for bridging. We're working very closely with Offchain Labs in the Arbitrum ecosystem in particular. And then we're also building a broader marketplace that all Ethereum rollups could use to sell their sequencing rights and get connected with third-party sequences that can basically do cross-chain bundles. So very exciting stuff, also pretty dense. So we'll try and keep it straightforward today.
My name is Chunda McCain. I'm one of the founders of Ion Protocol. We build native yield infrastructure for rollups of NAT chains, usually on top of underlying network and infrastructure yield primitives such as restaking, the intent ecosystem, specifically with cross-chain intents, and more.
Yeah, and I'm Clayton. I'm on the growth team at EigenLayer. Previously, I was at Figment, which is a staking infrastructure provider. Happy to be here.
Right. Let's maybe kick things off with a statement that Sriram was speaking about, which speaks about like an era where application developers are no longer bound by the throughput or the bandwidth constraints of blockchain systems. So I'm curious to just hear like your takes on this statement, what it means for each of you really.
I mean, I think in general it means you can do a lot more things as long as the incentives play out. Traditionally, it's very one-sided in terms of what an economic layer can look like for a layer 1 protocol, but the variety of ways that you can incentivize something when there's a lot more flexibility above the base layer is ultimately what restaking is all about.
Yeah, I mean, I definitely agree. I agree with the statement mostly. I think for 90 and 95% of use cases, that's true. I think when you talk about really low latency applications, let's say if you want to replicate something like credit card payment processing on chain, still really not there yet. Close, but not fully there. I actually think the largest bottleneck now when it comes to application developers is more about cross-chain state communication and finding ways to actually have fast finality between different state environments. So I think there's a confluence of a whole bunch of different strategies to actually solve that problem. I think specifically what we kind of focus on is looking at like liquidity-oriented methodologies of solving that problem, kind of building that chain abstraction ecosystem. But I'm curious to also hear kind of what the sequencer and kind of more infrastructure-oriented solutions to their problem also are.
Yeah, we are definitely building something that is intended to be high throughput and very responsive so that rollups using us can rely on us to move very quickly. And it's a very similar UX to what rollup customers expect today. So in our benchmarks from about a year ago, we were able to get about 29 megabytes a second through a single block in a half a second to a second. We reached finality after 2 to 3 seconds. So bridges are able to trust that confirmation for things like cross-chain transfers. I think that equates to about 120 to 200,000 ERC transactions roughly a second, if that metric matters to you. So yeah, we're definitely thinking about how we can add more capacity and throughput. I think that with the explosion of L2s and L3s across the Ethereum ecosystem in particular, there is a lot of block space available right now. And while Espresso is more infrastructure focused right now, we do really believe in helping rollups and their ecosystems to grow and helping as many users use as many apps as possible and like having a more retail focus over time. So I think it's about not only providing a ton of really cheap block space, but helping those ecosystems with their unique value props and finding ways that we can do exciting stuff together.
I don't know if this is going to directly answer the question, but I feel like it's an adjacent but helpful point. So we went from 2 years ago, I would say, when the rollups were in their earliest stages. I would say like capacity was still a bottleneck. Like Verity said, like it's not really a bottleneck today. If you're doing like a ton of throughput, something like proof of play, if you're familiar with like their game, they're putting a ton of data on chain. Like they just have their own dedicated space. What we're seeing now, the bottleneck is, and a lot of L2s are pivoting here, is like the interoperability of all of these things. And the reason why it's hard is it's not one solution will solve all problems, right? Like depending on your architecture, and two L2s that have slightly different architectures, they don't want to rely on the security of the other one if it's lesser security, for lack of a better word. So we're seeing like working with for example, Espresso has been really interesting to see, but it's like a multivariable problem, and I think that this is the next step of solving scale, because you don't want to have hundreds of chains that the user is exposed to when they're really just intended to be 100 databases, for example, with like one exposure point for users. So I don't know if I directly answer the question, but from the L2 perspective, like that's what we're really trying to solve now. It's been incredible to see like the Cambrian explosion of both innovation and scale that's happened in the last 18 months.
Right. Maybe on a related note, I think at least from some of the other discussions that were happening around ETC here, at least some of the things that I could see around developer opinions forming was the notion of having app-specific sequencing and app-specific composability and parametrizing things around those aspects. But I'm curious to see if there's a way that you see this possible in theory to kind of construct, and if that, and what are maybe the risks that you kind of see if this is a future that we have to kind of enable, or is the answer fundamentally like let's get everything on a single state machine and get things sequenced as per that?
I mean, I don't think that's how the non-digital space scales anything either. So I think depending on what sort of transactions they are, and if you get value out of having that transaction associated with a lot of other transactions, then you agree as a consumer or a business to put those transactions in the same bucket. But especially if you're talking about RWAs or permission layers or dark pools designed for specific people, you don't want to be having your transactions even pooled. Especially if you're trying to think about institutional adoption long term, not just at the staking layer where you do have traditional institutions now at some capacity participating in staking, but they're not really doing anything on chain in terms of like DeFi transactions. And Onyx will sell, JP Morgan Onyx will sell the fact that like your transactions are not touching anything at all besides what's going through this rail. So I don't see the value of having some grand universal sequencing layer in terms of how you get more people here.
Yeah, I generally agree there. And when you take the perception of the value of sequencing, specifically for applications, and that's why we're really seeing the growth of application-specific sequencing, is the actual value of being able to control the sequencer and the transaction flow is immense, especially for applications. You basically open the door to entirely new monetization strategies for applications. And I think now that we're seeing more and more innovation in that space, you kind of open the Pandora's box. I think a lot of applications see consolidated, like entirely consolidated or universal sequencing environments as kind of extracting out a little bit of their share of kind of how they could internalize some of that activity and revenue. I think the interesting thing to think about is whether or not we'll actually have sequencing settle in ecosystems or applications. Because like you said, for specific things like dark pools or specific things like, let's say, RWA focused use cases, it might be okay to actually share sequencing between a set of applications that are of the same type. I'm curious to see how the delineation over time between ecosystem and application-focused sequencing kind of evolves, and to see what types of applications are actually going to strike out as their own individual in terms of wanting to own the entire sequencing stack versus ecosystems that kind of congregate the sequencing stack between multiple different applications of the same ilk.
Yeah, it's an interesting take. Don't know that I entirely agree, but that's all good. We're all friends here and we all work together in some capacity. The reason that sequencing matters is because it allows whoever has control of that sequencing right, they can order transactions. They can also collect things like priority fees if they're a roll-up. Some apps may implement priority fees, and they can also extract things like MEV. So it does end up being like quite a contentious topic. But I think in reality, the most effective sequencer networks will be networks, and they will benefit from first mover advantage. And that will unlock things like chain A and chain B being sequenced together for a period of time. And the reason that that might matter is if you're trying to do something like a faster bridging use case, and the bridge doesn't want to trust a single sequencer, but they would be willing to trust a consensus protocol. And so that allows you to unlock bridging in a few seconds rather than waiting several minutes to days sometimes. We don't replace the canonical bridge though, that's still bound by fraud-proof windows. But I think that's like a really compelling use case because sometimes you send your funds and you're just waiting into the void for like whether that money arrived or not, which is very stressful. The other reason I could see something like a sequencing network taking off is DeFi is a very obvious one, but also gaming. So we're working very closely with Treasure, for example. They're going to have their primary chain, and then a lot of games as infinity chains that kind of come back to that main ecosystem. And they may want to have different gaming worlds that can be sequenced together for a period of time, have all those transactions happen at once, and allow users to effectively move through worlds, which I think is a very fun experience and not just about like maximizing your best price at a certain time. Yeah, the DeFi use cases I think are interesting because you could unlock swaps in a single block. But yeah, we need to do a bit more research before that's going to be ready to ship, but working with some really solid teams to make that happen.
Just to go back to the first point, the single state machine versus like modular like question that we're it's pivoted a fair bit in the sense that like the majority of teams launching their own chains, like for example that I'm excited about, they're actually doing things that they wouldn't be able to do on a public network. So that's like, you know, the most common example is like custom gas token, like in the protocol, as opposed to like abstracted at like a wallet layer, for example. Or you might see like, you know, like Rarible, for example, is built like create a royalty enshrinement into the protocol itself, right? So that would never happen, obviously, on like a public, credibly neutral network. But it's an interesting experimentation versus just like launching another network. And we're seeing that, you know, Kinto, for example, is doing it with like smart contract KYC wallets, like no EOAs can interact because they're trying to build like a KYC playground for DeFi. So like the reasons for sort of, you know, not having single state machines has kind of shifted. On the sequencing question, definitely unlocks a lot of UX, and I think it goes back to my earlier point, like figuring out like what should be exposed as a blockchain versus which use cases are really just, you know, maybe more efficient databases, or in some cases less efficient databases, is I think part of what we're trying to accomplish there.
Fair enough. I guess in some context, I'm also broadly curious, though, if we are moving to a world where systems are going to be fundamentally asynchronous, do you see like any need for a global settlement layer of sorts, or would you kind of see, you know, like individual applications, individual EVSs choosing to coordinate within themselves, but then redefining how they should be interacting with each other if there's like value that needs to be transmitted? Like my question is, I mean, did you see like a need for, should we say like a global payments layer, for instance, and an attribution layer, or do you see that a world where, you know, like there's like different services that are running verifiably, I suppose, but but you then have each of them choose to define how they would, for instance, pay each other or attribute value to each other.
I mean, without going back to the sequencing thing, specifically, I think, and also not trying to like do the whole, all this sequencers centralized like bullshit sort of commentary, but I think there's, you know, like a regulatory, like, you know, arbitrage opportunity as someone like Espresso, because, you know, eventually, right, if this space does get adopted more, having some sort of decentralized sequencer layer allows for these rollups to, you know, spend a lot more time on, you know, value-added services outside of like feeling the need to control something, and then that's their only business model. And then, you know, a regulator will look at that and it's like, well, you control the sequencer, so now you have to control who's on this rollup, which means that only certain people can be on it, et cetera, et cetera. So I think in that regard, having a larger state in general is probably good for experimentation. And then people will stop at some certain level, and it's like, this is enough for me. But because of that, like, we are doing it for a specific group of people, which in turn is not going to be a fully permissionless layer.
Okay. I guess since we are also speaking about restaking and the risks of the same, I'm broadly also curious to understand how, for instance, you guys, you know, like, think about the restaking landscape and how that would be part of your ecosystems that you're looking to build, and as it relates also to what you've been speaking about, what do you see are the risks that you have to encounter today that you need to, you know, like, mitigate, so it could ultimately be something that could be an integral service of, you know, like, your frameworks in one way, shape, or sense.
Yeah, I think from my perspective, so what was it's actually ties to inspiration on why we decided to build Ion, and like why specifically this idea of building native yield infrastructure focused on the restaking ecosystem. And the realization came from the fact that rollups are, well, one, for AVSs, their main customer for most primary majority of AVSs is rollups. Most of them are rollup services in some way, shape, or form. Even ones that may not seem like they directly service rollups, you usually do service rollups in some way, shape, or form. You take proof markets as an example, even though they're not specific to rollups, they, you know, ZK state proofs, or rollup state proofs are commonly sourced to proof markets for settlement. So when you look at the kind of ecosystem of AVSs that exist, and the fact that rollups are primarily the main customer, we realize that rollups are actually internalizing network risk across the entire infrastructure stack already. And so this usually retains or generates some kind of product or user-based upside from a UX standpoint, right? For DA, it's, you know, lower cost of execution. For proof markets, it's also similar concept, right? Decreasing proof costs via aggregation. And when you really internalize the fact that rollups are actually kind of internalize all these extraneous dependencies from an infrastructure standpoint, we realize that rollups are actually not benefiting from an economic standpoint from all this infrastructure and all this infrastructure risk that they internalize. So the idea is, how can we actually build, through restaking, pipelines where the revenue that infrastructure generates can actually go back to the rollup ecosystems that help power those pieces of infrastructure. So building that closed loop where the rollup, which brings economic activity through the applications it encourages, can actually also encourage the growth of the underlying infrastructure. And that infrastructure that generates revenue as a byproduct of that growth can then go back to benefit the rollup ecosystem as well. So kind of our priority and our focus between like this idea of native yield is to actually kind of close that loop for us when it comes to allowing infrastructure to then benefit the rollup in an economic sense as well as from a product sense.
Yeah, for us, Espresso is planning to be an actively validated service, which is obviously a key part of the EigenLayer ecosystem. So we have two parts of our product. We have a consensus mechanism called Hotshot that is offering our finality and DA layer. And then we have a marketplace where rollups can sell their sequencing rights. and third parties like maybe Ethereum block builders can bid to become sequencers for those rollups for a given number of slots. And basically what that means is that those sequencers could sequence for a single rollup, or they could bid and win a bundle of rollups and sequence across them. So that first marketplace dynamic is kind of happening separate to the protocol, but the outcome of the auction is fed into consensus, and then that's how we provide, finality and DA. So the consensus component of our product is actually where we're looking to use Ethereum restaking. And the reason that that's important is because a lot of our go-to-market is focused on Ethereum rollups in particular, even though we can support any VM or any kind of proof system. And so we think it's very important that for us to be closely aligned to Ethereum rollups, that we provide a finality and DA layer that is secured by Ethereum as well. And then as we look to ramp up the number of nodes that we operate, we have a higher and higher proportion of Ethereum validators running the network over time, and that way we can target a really strong finality guarantee that is very secure. I think some of the challenges with that is, we're building our consensus from the ground up, and so we need to make sure that Hotshot, which we're building, it's based off Hot Stuff 2, is stable enough before we add in the Ethereum restaking component, and then help to scale that over time. So there's no validator cap, but what we do need to do to make sure it's stable is progressively roll out and increase the number of nodes that can run the network. So it's very complex to manage a dual staking approach when you have a consensus mechanism. So that's most of the design areas that we're thinking about right now. Obviously, slashing and payments will come, and then we need to think about how we tap into the full Ethereum validator set with EigenLayer as we go to market and expand that network. So a lot more to do on that. That will be a bigger focus for us later this summer.
On the Arbitrum side, so we obviously using an optimistic fraud prover right now, so not really actively taking advantage of any of those components. So where we see in our ecosystem, sort of where liquid restaking is, the DeFi protocols that are building, right? These assets have very quickly grown to being a very meaningful segment of the market. We've seen I would say some small peaks and valleys and bumps along the way, but it's been very cool to see the progress. The numbers are astronomical. I don't know if anyone's tracking any of these protocols, but it's really incredible how quick the capital moves. So that's one of the areas that our team's been focusing on making sure we can support and everything can be safe.
Focusing, I guess, on maybe some of the risks that you kind of see with this, right? So if you were, as you are actively choosing to use AVSs to kind of secure some of these services and these frameworks that you're looking to architect and build, and some of these are obviously very complex. They involve consensus changes and constructions of new consensus algorithms, and making sure that this fits within the framework of risk assessment as we kind of see it. So I'm curious about what kind of tools do you feel, or what kind of additional documentation do we need from what we have today, so that you could have the longer tail of developers also choose to start developing AVSs by themselves. Obviously, you guys are in the thick of it. You know a lot about how these core mechanisms function, but my question is, how do we disseminate this knowledge to people so that it becomes more widely accessible?
I'll talk about the benefits maybe, but I think the difference between looking as a developer and planning to leverage this new service that just existed in the market is less about the stick and more about the carrot that's in front of these node operators that are on EigenLayer that will be actually providing the service in a decentralized way. And I think bridges in the past are a great example, but there's a lot of bridge hacks, and regardless of who that team was, it may have been their first project and they don't have a reputation, and then everyone loses their money, and then you hope that the next one is good. With these node operators that are on EigenLayer right now, a lot of them have been in the market as a staking infrastructure provider or a Bitcoin miner for sometimes even a decade if you're looking at some of them. And they have a reputation, you know, across a wide variety of ecosystems, to where it being an AVS on EigenLayer, and you know, a lot of these people are known, to where there's much more risk in terms of, you know, how they exist as an organization today to you know, be malicious to that AVS compared to a new, even decentralized network that isn't necessarily connected to Restaked Ethereum or some other asset that's connected to the operator. So I think one of the risks is, you know, standardization across these AVSs, because then you kind of want those same operators to be on all of them, especially the ones that have reputation to lose. So key management is an important thing to solve moving forward, because if you are looking at what operators are going to be looking at when valuing a new opportunity, it's, you know, they want to make sure it's profitable. They want to make sure that they can do it in a secure way, because getting slashed kind of screws up their business model because people won't stake to them. And they want to make sure that they can do it legally as well. So when talking about rewards distribution and stuff like that, how AVS is going to send rewards, which I'm sure you've been thinking about, is important as well.
Yeah, from my perspective, I think you hit the nail on the head when you framed it in the sense of kind of awareness being the main problem. I think the core problem here is that there's a lot of opacity around around dependencies in various systems that are present within the restaking kind of ecosystem. So there's kind of two I'll highlight that I think about a lot. One of which is opacity around, you know, jumping off the node operator comment, node operator dependencies. Yeah, you're absolutely right in the fact that there's this kind of pristine set of node operators who have multi-year track records, been securing networks since, you know, the genesis of many of these. However, the problem with having a consolidated set of node operators is if these node operators have dependencies that are contagious between multiple AVSs, if you have a small consolidated set of node operators and those dependencies are kind of set between a large set of AVSs, well then you have this case where, you know, one small hiccup in one of these dependencies, which are very, very hard to visualize, can propagate throughout many AVSs who, you know, the AVSs won't be aware of these dependencies, the LRTs won't be aware of these dependencies, and of course, EigenLayer themselves don't internalize these dependencies as well. So I think bringing a larger push towards node operators on not necessarily accountability, because I feel like many of them are very accountable for when they do make mistakes, but more on visualization and understanding system design and dependencies from an operating standpoint, especially between multiple networks, is going to be extremely important. And then the second part, which I'll make a little shorter, is I feel like there's kind of this empty space in the ecosystem where realistically, when we look at restaking, we're looking at a new form of risk, right? This idea of like infrastructure or network-oriented risk. And the point of innovation that we're focusing on here is this idea of innovations on the network level. Unfortunately, when we look at the greater, let's say, DeFi or any type of ecosystem where you're kind of internalizing this kind of risk, where you're creating dependencies on this kind of risk, there aren't that many actors who actually live in this between having a very low level understanding of network architecture and also having a very low level understanding of economic models and potential negative economic externalities of these network mechanisms. I think we should be focusing on cultivating an ecosystem of third-party participants who we can depend on to really provide that analysis and make sure we push them to the forefront to be able to support them in kind of participating and having them as a cornerstone of AVS deployment, AVS development, and also building any type of financial primitives on top of AVSs.
I mean, I think the really interesting thing about this ecosystem and what we're able to unlock through restaking is a company like Espresso can be going after, you know, roll-up as a service providers, and then we have our own like network that we're bootstrapping right now, but we have this plan to tap into like a network of very established like professional operators, and then we start to think about, well, who are the stakers that we want to like bring into our ecosystem to delegate to these operators to run these AVSs for us. And so you need to start thinking about like not only are the how do we get like roll-ups incentivized to work with us and provide a great product with solid network effects, but we're also thinking about things like, well, how do we engage stakers and restakers who may not have heard of Espresso to get them to allocate kind of capital, and how do we reward them appropriately? So I think it's a really interesting challenge from a go-to-market standpoint. Chunda, I'd love to hear your take on like some of the dependencies that you mentioned. Like where do you, or how do you see that playing out? If you have like a specific example in mind.
Yeah, you're talking about node operator dependencies?
Yeah, or like even you were saying AVS dependencies where they're like maybe all in the same like EigenLayer pool, staking to multiple AVSs, or just wanted to tease that out a bit more.
Yeah, the idea of like shared security is like when you share, of course the core concept of shared security is that you're sharing the same pool of capital of security between multiple different AVSs. Inherently, AVSs don't share awareness of other AVSs and the dependencies that they may have when it comes to what causes slashing, the negative externalities of slashing, and so on and so forth. So you could have situations where you have propagated effects on the infrastructure level, where let's say you're a network which has a dependency on a DA solution, which you have a failure of that DA solution. And all of a sudden, let's say some of the Oracle feeds on a network, which are also sharing that same pool of security, so that network is now weakened. And then two, are also supposed to fetch data from historical state, which they can't query or have access to. Well, now you have a halting of this Oracle system, which is also sharing like very similar dependencies. And this kind of begs the idea of how do we actually create systems where, and there's the question of whether or not these are social or protocol based, where AVSs can communicate with each other, especially about this idea of sharing pooled capital, of sharing infrastructure dependencies, and also being on the same page of the potential negative externalities, whether that's in kind of corporate coalitions or protocol based coalitions, or actually creating a coordination environment for that. I feel like the design space is very open, but something that definitely needs to happen.
Yeah, I guess what I wonder is like if an AVS like Espresso decided to exit an operator from our, pooled security model for a particular reason, does that penalize them in other ecosystems? Like maybe they weren't as strong at like being an operator for sequencing, but they're still very good at like being an AVS for a bridge. So yeah, I think that's like a really interesting kind of challenge that we're gonna see how things play out over the next few months.
Yeah, I mean, it definitely would if like the whole value proposition for an operator is like, don't get slashed, get the highest reward rate as possible.
Yeah.
If like jailing is actually an interesting, stick. When people, talk about slashing a lot for EigenLayer, there is like this idea that maybe an AVS can slash 100% of the capital that's delegated to an operator. It's likely not, how the market is going to play out, but if your goal is to get the reward rate from 3.28% or whatever it is right now for staked ETH and turn that restaked ETH into whatever number it will be, if Espresso is generating like 10% of that reward on the restaking layer, and now you're just kicked out and everyone knows that you messed up, like people will leave. And so it is so much of a threat to where, it doesn't force people to be perfect everywhere, that there's a reward rate source for that ETH.
Another point that I was thinking about was what you were mentioning, the amount of risk to the ecosystem as you kind of see it, because that might mean at some point you might be left with a bag of assets that are not backed by anything. So
it's not. I think it's definitely an introduced risk. It's not novel in that sense, though. Like for example, obviously I'm sure most people remember like the multi-chain bridge hack. I think it was like last year, 18 months ago. It's not an exact parallel, but it's similar, where like the derivative asset essentially goes to zero when the underlying is pulled out. And I think that that's the kind of risk that historically has been internalized in DeFi. I would say, to me, obviously I think the liquid restaking concept in general is more productive than like these sort of bridges that were like maybe secured ever, if not at all, but and also probably just more productive and more efficient use of capital. So I think like the endeavor is obviously extremely valuable, right? Because we're unlocking more yield, we're creating more efficiencies in these systems. But in terms of like the ability to internalize that risk, I feel like the market has some experience doing that with, so it's like, I don't know, maybe they're not parallels, I don't know, I'm curious for your take, but like they're not the same, but I think it's like the mental model, especially maybe the stage of where liquid restaking is today, where maybe like you know between smart contract and crypto economic security risk, I think the market actually can price these things. So.
Yeah, I think from my perspective, I'd say I agree with the former, a bit disagree with the latter. I think a lot of DeFi has been, the precedent of DeFi has been built upon like the systems that we're used to and the risks that we're used to in the general market, this idea of like generalized like economic market risk. To this date, outside of infrastructure that we focused on and DeFi products that we focused on, we really haven't seen the internalization of infrastructure risk as a market to be priced. And I think the innovation in that sector of DeFi is a bit slow. I think a lot of protocols have this tendency to default internalize the risk in LRTs and other type of restaked assets as some derivation of market risk, when really, again, like I mentioned before, you're looking at a completely different type of risk that's being introduced into the market. The thing that I'm really interested in, and hopefully like pioneer by building these types of DeFi products at the network level, is trying to build DeFi infrastructure that's more aware of network risks at a low level. Because I think only then will we actually be able to build like accurate pricing models. Because when you, let's say, like look at an AMM, or you look at any of the kind of traditional pre-existing pieces of infrastructure in DeFi, like the way lending LTVs are determined, many of these things don't internalize, or depend on the market to internalize pricing. And as you can see, like most assets price at parity until they don't, right?
I think
and that's...
Yes and no, in the sense that like, so if you take, for example, let's say a typical rollup, which is like a canonical bridge secured by Ethereum, versus like an L1 like, you know, Phantom, which I think their bridge was the multi-chain bridge. I think when you look at the yields that were derived from like, you know, either LPing into those protocols, they were different. I think that might be where that risk might have been captured and priced, right? Like you might, if you were LPing into a DEX on Phantom, you might have gotten 7%, where if it was like Uniswap on Arbitrum, it might have been 5%. So I think, maybe I'm wrong, but I don't have like actual empirical data, but it wouldn't surprise me if that was like sort of maybe inefficiently.
But are we getting to the case that developers are actually attributing things or looking at things in a much more sharper lens in that sense? And
We've seen that a lot, like post some of those bridge hacks in like 2022, we definitely saw a lot more focus on like the importance of a canonical bridge, the safety. Personal experience, this is all anecdotal obviously, but in terms of like where we were seeing it, 100%.
Awesome. I think I just want to kind of give all the speakers a chance to kind of express, you know, like what they feel, you know, should be takeaways for an audience of both developers and users as we're thinking about this broader landscape of restaking and you know, like new frameworks that are emergent from the same. So anything that people should be considering, should be having at the top of their minds when they're actually using these services or building these services would be very helpful to hear.
Yeah, I mean, I think it makes, you know, especially ABS deployment a lot different go-to-market activity over time, to where, you know, if you are launching a decentralized middleware service, the only way it can be decentralized from day one is releasing a token and launching a foundation, and like all these things have to happen and you know, step-by-step frameworks, and then you kind of like lose control over the ability to slowly develop it over time because it needs to be decentralized. So you know, I think as the EigenLayer ecosystem plays out, and maybe there may be some interesting funding models for ABSs where they, you know, take a pool of ETH to start paying operators, or a pool of USDC when they're raising money for their project, or, you know, Eigen as a you know, foundation may start like incentivizing these ABSs directly as well. You don't have to do everything all at the same time, which, you know, for some ABSs or middleware services or blockchains may be problematic because you're not generating protocol revenue, which may be actually the main thing that you're trying to accomplish, and selling to, you know, potentially developers or consumers of your application. And so, yeah, I mean, I think that's what will be interesting. Like less tokens from day one for no reason, that just results in like VC exits before anything actually happens.
Yeah, I think the takeaway I would say for every stakeholder, users, developers alike, strive for accountability and from all of the dependencies that you see in the system that you're interacting with. Strive for visualization, not necessarily demand it in the sense of kind of coming to the forefront aggressively, but expect it and be wary of situations where you're not given that level of transparency about dependencies that exist in the system, especially when people are innovating on novel designs that may affect things like risk and stability of new networks. And for those who are interested in building the ecosystem, I feel like that's an open space where building these systems that enable and kind of put accountability at the forefront for all the stakeholders in the system. There's many places where you can build things in that part of the ecosystem.
Yeah, I mean, at Espresso, I think we're all about building the infinite garden of Ethereum and helping the roll-up ecosystem to be more composable and faster and more secure over time. So you'll see us focusing a lot of our go-to-market on Ethereum, but if you're building in other ecosystems, reach out. Bezabel is the same for me on Twitter and on Telegram. I think the nice thing about what we're building is that it's a product that can more or less stand on its own 2 feet, but it is made more secure and able to scale more through restaking. And so we're excited to have these kind of novel use cases coming up around faster bridging, cross-chain swaps, and more. So watch this space. We're also hosting a Eurocup watch night tonight, so if you feel like taking a break from all the GigaBrain topics we've been covering, come and hang out and watch the game.
Yeah, sorry, my mic's falling off my head. Want to echo what Chunda was saying about like accountability is super important. I've seen this play out across the stack where you just assume everything works until it doesn't. So like this is such a critical, important component. Just that's a really important thing. And the other thing I would say is, you know, blockchains are extremely efficient at matching incentives and yields, and if you're not innovating, you're going to get left behind. So it's really important to think about just as a category, like what restaking has unlocked, just even from an economic perspective, you know, beyond sort of all the different topics we discussed here around efficiencies, et cetera, because it's going to move extremely quickly.
Yeah.
Thank you all again.
Thanks.
For engaging with everyone, and hope this conversation was helpful for people who are watching this. So thank you again.